Hello, everyone. Welcome to my presentation on queering. I think I'll call it queer belonging in South Africa. I am Xavier Livermon, Associate Professor of Feminist Studies and Critical Race and Ethnic Studies at UC Santa Cruz. Before jumping in, I'd like to just thank the Program in African Studies for the invitation, particularly Megan, Bimbola, and Chris. I'm really excited to be a part of being able to create a series of conversations where we can talk about um, what queering belonging could look like on the African continent. And I approach that through this question of queer belonging in South Africa. To begin, I think it's important to kind of define what I mean by belonging. And I really draw from the late South African scholar Mickey Van Zyl um, in her 2009 discussion of the limits of rights language and discourse for queer South Africans. She defines belonging as such. She says, belonging is a thick concept, which includes affective and cultural elements, making visible the limitations of citizenship through contextualizing the politics and power dynamics and discourses of human rights. It also allows us to focus on the everyday dynamics of oppression, which form the bedrock of marginalization and othering. And so Manzil was really speaking very specifically about the limitations to the Constitution of South Africa to really guarantee the rights of queer South Africans, particularly the most marginalized and most vulnerable of queer South Africans. Black queer South Africans living in the peripheries of the urban areas, living in rural areas, folks who were not cis normative in their gender presentation, et cetera. And and one of the things that she was trying to deal with was a lot of discussion that was happening in South Africa politically and also in the activist realm and academically around this disconnect between this very progressive constitution and the actual lived experiences of the majority of queer people in the South African context. And so she thought of belonging as a way to think a little bit more critically beyond rights discourse. Um, and so for her, I kind of took that in my own discussions of what queer belonging could look like, particularly for Black queer South Africans. And so what I drew from that is that belonging is not individualistic, but communal and contextual. There's a focus on the cultural, the affective, and sort of contextualization of power dynamics. There's a focus on the dynamics of everyday oppression. And belonging as a concept allows us to think about questions of safety, security, equality, dignity, and respect for difference for all citizens. Now, um, in the criticism of rights language that is embedded in Van Ziel's original article and that I also take up in my own work, I want to be clear that I see rights language encoded in constitutions, encoded in legal structures as baselines. I see them as necessary, but not necessarily sufficient conditions, maybe not even always necessary, but we can think about that or talk about that, but they're not necessarily sufficient conditions. So the criticism that I'm offering is not a criticism against rights-based language and the use of rights-based language to think about or to create a kind of baseline communal and societal conversation about rights for any group of people. It's rather to just suggest that that belonging offers something that pushes past some of the limitations of rights discourse. And so, in thinking about belonging, we have an opportunity to think about these cultural and effective modes that oftentimes cannot necessarily be counted for in more traditional legal rights discourse. And so, in my own work, I've explored this question of belonging through two different frameworks. One has been through the ways that Black queer South Africans have engaged questions of tradition, and the other has been on the ways in which Black queer South Africans have repurposed um, seemingly heterosexual and heteronormative spaces for their own forms of queer pleasure, right? And these are usually heteronormative and heterosexual nightlife and leisure spaces that Black queer South Africans have found ways to sort of maneuver through, repurpose, and reframe spatially to kind of work as queer spaces, as Black queer spaces. And so I want to think about both of these as sites of belonging. But when I think about that, I do also want to just give a caveat um, that I understand that there are certain concerns about belonging um, being a space for um, a reformulated normativity, right? And I want to think about, and I want to kind of offer the precaution or the caveat that belonging, as I understand it in the African context, is not necessarily like queer belonging, right? And queering belonging in an African context is not necessarily a push towards normativity. It's not necessarily about forms of homonationalism. It's not necessarily about forms of class exclusivity. So belonging should not be seen as necessarily a desire for normativity. Now, that doesn't mean that some forms of queering belonging are about, shifting the queer into a more normative subject, right, in order for that subject to belong, right? But a lot of queering belonging is about changing normativities and changing the frameworks of belonging, right? And so, in some sense, it sort of separates itself out from, I think, a more Western global North framework that gets concerned about questions of belonging in relationship to normativity, right? So I don't want to impose that framework on the South African case, even though I think that there are possibilities for belonging and normativity to work together, right, to reinforce one another. So as I mentioned, the two kind of ways that I've explored what queering belonging could look like in the South African context and with Black South African queer folk in particular has been this discussion of queering tradition. It's the use of African traditional religions. It's the discussion of circumcision ceremonies as a space for thinking about alternative forms of gender and sexuality. It's about marriage customs, particularly the exchange of lobola, which is often incorrectly translated as bride price, but that would be probably one of the closest English approximations. Um, but the question of customary marriage and lobola as a space for reimagining certain forms of traditions and to rethink certain kinds of parameters. Um, and I want to think a lot, and I think a lot about that because what I discovered in the sort of post 2000s period was that there wasn't just necessarily a wholesale rejection of the sort of what I would argue the heteromasculine and heteropatriarchal interpretation of tradition, but rather, what was happening was that Black queer South Africans were finding in various different kinds of traditional practices possibilities for belonging that did not really refer back to a certain kind of human rights framework, right, and constitutional rights framework, but actually was embedded in certain kinds of cultural context, right? And so, in many ways, was a reply to or an answer to certain kinds of frameworks that suggested excision and exclusion for the African queer body, right? And so, queering tradition really was a way for, um, or has been a way for Black South Africans to reimagine a set of practices. And I think there's a larger link to larger kinds of conversations around decolonization particularly decolonization in the realm um, of both the material and the cultural and the way that those two kind of embed and reinforce one another. And I'm thinking here of in the article, I discuss how Sengomas as a set of practices within African traditional religions in South Africa that allow for a certain kind of flexibility around gender, identity, and gender performance has been a really important space for Black queer South Africans to imagine and reimagine their own positionality within their societies and cultures through the lens of African traditional religions. Um, Similarly, marriage customs such as lobola, right, have had to be completely reimagined, right, outside of their traditional heteropatriarchal framework, right, to include what would it mean? How would this practice have to be reformulated in very critical ways to include men, right? How would this practice need to be reformulated in very interesting ways that would allow two women to engage in the practice, right? So you've seen instances of two women paying the bola for one another, right? Or really interesting creative ways in thinking about um, how lobola could work in relationships to men marrying one another. And these are all forms of what I call cultural labor. And I'm borrowing that concept from Marlon M. Bailey's work in Butch Queens Up in Pumps, who borrows that concept, and also a little bit from Murray Miller Young's work on Black women in pornography, right? And both of them are actually ultimately referring back to Robin D.G. Kelly's work on cultural labor, right? To think about the ways that queer people productively and creatively engage these questions of tradition, not seeing them as static and not kind of allowing a heteronormative interpretation to be the only interpretation of these practices, right? But rather to reclaim these practices as spaces for African queerness. And then what that does, right? What does that do to rethinking questions of tradition? What does that do for thinking about questions of what a decolonization or a post-colonization society would look like, right? To kind of reimagine questions of religion and ethics outside of a kind of Western framework, but toward a kind of African cosmology, to think about traditional practices allowing space for certain kinds of gender and sexual fluidity. Right. So this is the work of queering tradition that a lot of Black queer South Africans have been involved in. And it's one of the more creative and interesting and politically productive ways in which Black queer people have tried to create a queer belonging or have queered forms of belonging. Secondarily, in my work, I look at a lot of nightlife and leisure spaces as spaces of pleasure and possibility and as spaces of different forms of politics. I talk a lot about how certain kinds of politics can be rehearsed on the dance floor or in the space of the club before they kind of end up being actual tangible material effects and rights that we can see sort of in everyday practice, right? And so that as a space of imagination, as a space of fantasy, as a space of play, right? Nightlife and leisure spaces oftentimes are also spaces for certain kinds of boundaries and norms to be reimagined and broken. And here, I think a lot about the shebeen and the Stockwell, the shebeen are sort of informal taverns. Stockwells are generally monthly parties where food and drink are served to the local community as a fundraising initiative for a Stockwell. The Stockwell itself is the fundraising arm. It's usually a social grouping of people, generally women. But I've been seeing certain forms of queer Stockwells or Stockwells that include women and queer men and queer women kind of coming together to form a mutual aid society, basically. And these parties are their fundraising arm. And so I write about both shebeens in Kwaito bodies and Stockville's in the article in Gender, Place, and Culture as places where Black queer South Africans have repurposed and reimagined spaces that are framed as and exist as heteronormative spaces through reappropriating the space, reimagining the dance floor, and creating possibilities for queer desirability, queer desires to be enacted, um, and queer possibility to be enacted within the space that on the surface appears to be very hyper heterosexual and hyper heteromasculine. And so I talk about the ways in which this has been a potentially um, productive queering of space, particularly for Black queer men, because of the sort of gender ratios of who kind of comes into these spaces, and the certain kinds of economic frameworks that function around who has disposable income, right? And so I think about how Black queer South Africans repurpose these leisure spaces, and in the process of repurposing these leisure spaces, sort of claim space for themselves within spaces that are sort of marked as heterosexual and heteronormative spaces. So I do want to leave with a couple of questions about where we go with these questions, where we go with this discussion of belonging and querying belonging. So, one of the points that I think is really important is to always point out the productive tension between forms of belonging and desires to build them and rejections of belonging, right? So, there are Black queer South Africans who are just not interested in this conversation about tradition. They are not interested in reclaiming those traditions. They're not interested in rooting their queerness in forms of African culture or African cultural and social practices. Um, they're also not interested in repurposing sort of spaces of Black heteronormativity or for their own purposes, right? They want to just exist in and create queer exclusive spaces, right? Or they want to imagine their queerness as attached um, to something other than forms of African culture and traditions, right? And I think that that tension between those who want to imagine forms of belonging and build forms of belonging, right? And those who want to kind of reject those is one that I think is productive and necessary to the conversation. And so, to that extent, we can think about belonging as offering both possibilities and limitations, right? To thinking about how we can queer these practices. Um, the queering of these practices oftentimes it does, at its very heart, think about a reimagining of these practices. Um, and I think that that's an important thing to think about. So I think I'll just leave with a couple of questions, which is um, I think the ways that queer belonging can both disarticulate from questions of normativity, but reinforce questions of normativity. But to also think about what are the possibilities embedded in queering belonging and what are the limitations to that, right? And is there potentially something more productive in the rejection of belonging? So, with that, I will just leave you with this brief bibliography. If you're interested in any of these concepts and how I engage them um, in a South African context, probably the best piece is the usable traditions piece that's listed first here. The second piece also engages that question of repurposing of space by queer people. And I thank you for the invitation. I thank you for the engagement. And if you'd like to discuss any of these ideas further with me, I'm happy to have conversation further. I can be reached at Livermon, my surname, at ucsantacruz.edu. Sorry, ucsc.edu. So Livermon at ucsc.edu. Thank you so much. Um, and I hope that what I had to present was productive for your conversation.